Someone recently sent me a photo of the father-son softball game that was held every year at Fire Island with kids and parents my age. And I never got to play in that game because I love softball, but I didn't have a father. You know, there were moments like that were so dramatic for me that my family wasn't like other families, and it was rough to be that outsider in a way. And yet, in some ways, this is one thing we talk that you were mentioning, the imaginary conversations that I have in the book between me and my dad. And my dad asks me, what was it like growing up without a father? Because my mother never remarried. You know, I say to him how much I missed his presence, and yet not having a male role model was in some ways very liberating, because the male role models in the 1950s were kind of limited. You know, there was hunting and fishing and guns and no, that was not, I mean, I was not going to fit that mold. And so it allowed me the freedom, in a sense, to define for myself what it meant to be a man.
Hi, Envisionairs. Welcome to the EnvisionAir Podcast. This is the podcast where we envision living our best lives, ones filled with unlimited possibilities, by exploring everyday topics related to health, wealth, community, and love. This podcast is for information purposes only and should not be considered to be medical, legal, tax, financial, or other professional advice.
This podcast does not encourage or endorse any illegal activity.
We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liability that may arise from the information in this podcast.
The views explored in the podcast may not always be those of the host.
On today's episode, we're going to be in the book nook today, talking with the literary extraordinaire, Zack Rogow, author, poet, playwright, translator, and educator. He has recently released his memoir, Hugging My Father's Ghost, which I had the privilege to read. And all I have to say is, wow. Wow, wow, wow. This book is like nothing I've ever read before. It's essentially Zack's journey to solve the mystery of his father, Lee Rogow, who tragically passed when Zack was only 3 years old. Lee himself was a very talented writer and drama critic for The Hollywood Reporter, and he also has sold over 50 stories in magazines and print over his lifetime, including his most well-known short story called That Certain Flavor. In his memoir, Zack shares very honestly and vulnerably all aspects of his father, including some very intimate details and unpublished works of his father, which are all included in the book. What I found most special about this book was the series of imagined conversations he had with his father, discussing these unpublished and published works, and sharing that happened between them so authentically. This book made me cry, it made me laugh, it moved me immensely to reflect on my own relationship with my father and my mother. So I am very excited and very grateful that we have Zack on the EnvisionAir Podcast to not only talk about this brilliant book, but also his own journey into the literary world. So a very warm welcome. Thank you, Zack, so much for being on the podcast.
Hi, Nicole, and hi, Envisionairs. And I'm so thrilled to be here. And it was just serendipity that we connected. And I'm so pleased that you invited me. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. So, and I know there are some Envisionairs listening who know that you're coming on and they're very excited to hear about your story as well. So, welcome.
Thank you.
So after reading your book, I feel like obviously I know you. Like I feel like we're good friends now. But I think it'd be really interesting for the listeners to hear about your childhood, particularly what you shared in the book. You mentioned that you grew up in a loving circle of families that valued warmth, intelligence, wit, and culture. And of course, being the son of Lee Rogow, without having maybe as many childhood memories of your father, I'd love to hear more about how your childhood was. And obviously also Mickey Rogow, who seems like she was an amazing powerhouse of a woman.
My parents were both really interesting people. I grew up in Manhattan in the 1950s and 60s, which was by itself a very interesting time of great transformation in the world. And my parents were both bohemians. They met in Greenwich Village at NYU, where New York University, where they were both students in the 1930s. They were children of the Great Depression, the so-called greatest generation that went through the Depression and World War II. And this book, my book, Hugging My Father's Ghost, is to some degree an exploration of the greatest generation and what really went on for people of my parents' time. And in some ways, they were the greatest generation. In other ways, things were much more complicated than that. And one of the things in the book is, as you were mentioning, Nicole, these unpublished works of my dad, which include a journal that he kept during World War II. So he was the captain of a submarine chaser ship in the US Navy in World War II. And he admits in his journal some very personal things about how he didn't really want to fight. He avoided the draft. And it was only when he realized that he could no longer avoid being called up that he enlisted in the Navy. And he was part of this interesting group of people who had no military experience at all. I mean, he was a college student basically who had worked a little bit in public relations and writing. And when Pearl Harbor happened, the bombing of the US naval fleet in Hawaii in 1941, and basically the US Navy had to start from scratch again, they had this very interesting program called the 90-Day Wonders. But I'm getting away from my own childhood. Anyway, my own childhood was in the circle of people who really loved and appreciated the arts and things of the mind, but we're also very lively people. You know, my mother and father loved to go out dancing at nightclubs in New York, and they were known for winning prizes for their rumba dancing, for they loved Latin dancing. And they were a very glamorous couple. Here's a picture of them on their delayed honeymoon. I believe this was in 1948 in France.
Beautiful.
And my mom is wearing her Dior black skirt. If people have seen that series, The New Look, which talks about Dior and his innovations, she went right to the Dior store in Paris when she got to Paris and bought the skirt there.
Love it.
So they were a very glamorous couple, but there was a lot of tragedy as well in my childhood because, as you mentioned, Nicole, my dad died when I was 3. He died in an airplane crash. And my family was very challenged after that to rise above that tragedy. And it was really difficult for my mom as a single woman in the 1950s, an age of a lot of conformity when families were supposed to fit into a particular box, and we didn't fit the box.
Yes. And I remember that you said, because when I was reading about that, and I like, there's a chapter where you also talk about your mother, and that I thought it was very amazing to learn about her. And because I was thinking to myself, how did she find the strength in that time, like that inner strength to just push on and to raise 2 small children? Because I think your sister was 6, I think, as well at the time,
Correct.
or 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, 2 young kids alone as a single mom in New York. But then I do remember you saying that she really just threw herself into the things that she loved, the theater, dance, culture, art. And also she really tried to help you guys, I think, to give you a very well-rounded childhood. Right. So how do you think, like, her strength, talking about her inner strength and how she helped you guys in your childhood without your dad, how do you think she summoned that strength?
Well, it amazes me now that she was able to do that because she was a person of a lot of roller coaster emotions. So she was sometimes the life of the party and a very glamorous and charming and funny woman who had a boisterous laugh, such a boisterous laugh that we got invited to the tapings of live comedy albums because they wanted to have her laugh on the soundtrack. And yet she also suffered from Great Depression that caught up with her at various times in her life. And that's one of the subplots of this narrative in the book. And I don't know. I mean, she had a very loving mother herself. She always talked about her mom, although her mom died quite young too. So my mom grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which at the time that she was growing up in the 1920s was the most crowded slum in the United States. And people lived in these railroad flats where there was just one room after another and very little privacy or space. I don't know. I mean, she was a very strong woman in a lot of ways, and there were so many things that she loved and enjoyed, as you were mentioning, in culture. She would take us to museums. She was very politically active. She would bring us into the voting booth when she voted, and she at a certain point got the travel bug, and she took us to Europe and Mexico, and she was fortunate enough, although she had a very poor childhood, desperately poor childhood, to the point where she and her family had to run out in the middle of the night because they were behind on the rent and they had to abscond from their rental apartment. But she was fortunate enough after my dad died that my family was comfortable and, was able to provide us with so much in terms of education and culture.
Absolutely. I loved hearing those stories of her bringing you guys to Amalfi. And, she just seems like this sort of woman who was so strong, because there is a story of her. She decided, just because she would just want it to be fun, and she wore pajamas to a restaurant when she one evening, right? And
Yes.
she just would do these things without even caring what people thought.
That's very true. Yeah. She was also kind of androgynous. Both my parents had androgynous nicknames. My dad, whose real name was Leon, was called Lee, which could be a woman's name too. And my mom, whose real name was Mildred, she
Mhm.
hated her name, Mildred. She always went by the name Mickey, like Mickey Mouse. And both of those names are kind of androgynous names. And although my
Yeah.
mom could be very femme and wore a lot of makeup and wouldn't leave the house without her lipstick and perfume, she also liked wearing men's clothes. And she would go out wearing a man's tailored shirt and slacks and kind of Marlene Dietrich style. Marlene Dietrich was her role model for fashion.
Amazing.
Uh, so, yeah, she was quite a character. She was the first woman to wear a bikini on Fire Island, a very popular resort near New York, and she designed the bathing suit herself and had it made by a seamstress because she had seen women wearing bikinis in France in the 1940s, and she wanted to be up to date.
She was a real trailblazer, it seems, and I really loved learning about her. What do you think is the biggest lesson you learned from your mom?
Well, she was such a loving person, physically uh, warm, and she loved humor. She loved laughter. And I think, laughter is so healing. We had a lot of pain and tragedy. And yet I think humor was something that kept us going through all of that. So I think maybe her love of humor and
Yeah.
her big-heartedness. I mean, she was not afraid to feel deeply.
Love that. Real human-centered human, if you will, like a heart-centered human is what I like to call that.
Oh, that's a nice phrase. I like that,
Yeah,
Nicole.
yeah. So I appreciate that you were only 3 when your father passed away, and you explained that you had one memory, if you will, of your dad as a child, growing up. You weren't sure. It's funny. I kind of it's a half laugh, when you're reading it, but you said that you weren't sure if that memory was implanted by hearing that story narrated to you, which is very funny. Anyway, and you were talking about how your dad was cooking his mishmop soup, which is like a
Mm.
combination of like tomato soup and chicken noodle soup. Love that.
Uh,
And so, but now that you've written the book and you've discovered what you've discovered, and you reflect back on your childhood, particularly, what do you think you miss the most about not having him physically in your life as a child?
well, I think of my two parents, people play different roles in relationships. And my mom was sort of the spontaneous, fun-loving, let's do this at the spur of the moment kind of person. My dad was kind of the more reliable, uh, breadwinner, emotionally stable, and I didn't have that. So I had the excitement of having this mom who would do all kinds of crazy things, but I didn't have the stable parent who was the one who was always there and on time and that kind of thing. So that was a lot to miss. Someone recently sent me a photo from my childhood of we spent the summers on a place called Fire Island, which is a strip of land south of Long Island near New York, where a lot of middle class New Yorkers, particularly Jewish families, had homes. It's also known as a gay Mecca, Fire Island. But the part of Fire Island that we were vacationing at in the summers was more middle class families who couldn't afford the Hamptons. And someone recently sent me a photo of the father-son softball game that was held every year at Fire Island with kids and parents my age. And I never got to play in that game because I love softball, but I didn't have a father. There were moments like that were so dramatic for me that my family wasn't like other families, and it was rough to be that outsider in a way.
Yeah.
And yet, in some ways, this is one thing we talk that you were mentioning, the imaginary conversations that I have in the book between me and my dad. And my dad asks me, what was it like growing up without a father? Because my mother never remarried. And I say to him how much I missed his presence. And yet, not having a male role model was in some ways very liberating, because the male role models in the 1950s were kind of limited. There was hunting and fishing and guns and no, that was
Yeah.
not, I was not going to fit that mold. And so it allowed me the freedom, in a sense, to define for myself what it meant to be a man. That was liberating in a way, particularly at that time.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, talking about missing your dad, I really appreciated hearing the story. Obviously, your journey going to Yale University. You talked about how you had feelings of not belonging with some of compared to your peers, not being part of secret societies and so on. In some ways, I mentioned this to you. It really resonated with me. You know, going to Cambridge, to study law as a more mature student, being very North American, and in all culturally as well. And it was really I had moments where I felt that as well. And anyway, but what was really striking was that even though your father physically wasn't there, there was a really special moment that I'd love for you to share when you were in the library studying, and all of a sudden, not only did you feel less maybe alone, but you felt more connected to being at Yale. Can you share that story with us?
Sure. Yeah. So my dad was a writer, as I mentioned, and he was quite widely published. And when I got to Yale, I majored in English, and I, strangely enough, felt in a way more distant from my father, even though I was studying literature, which was his field, because the literature we were studying was very much of a particular world that also reflected the world at Yale. At that time, Yale was still very high percentage what people called preppies, people who'd gone to boarding schools, who came from a particular background. And that was very much the dominant culture at Yale at the time, although it was changing, but it was still very much the culture, to the point where I had a professor who actually sat down at the beginning of the first class and said, we're going to be discussing the literature of our Anglo-Saxon heritage in this class.
Right.
And looking at me kind of like, I don't know where this guy fits in. So in a weird way, I felt farther from my father at Yale because I knew that the kind of writing that he did, which was about families like the family that I grew up in, that was not even close to what my professors, my literature professors, thought of as literature. So there was this moment where I was studying the library. I was always late on my papers, you know. After everybody had gone home for the semester, I was in the library trying to finish my last paper, and I was working on a paper, and I was looking up a word that I didn't know in the dictionary, which was shibboleth, which means a kind of common saying, I believe, like a trite saying that gets repeated over and over. But I didn't know what it meant. So I'm looking up this word, and of course, you know, and it's in one of these dictionaries that it's sitting on like a wooden stand that looks like a pulpit that a priest would preach from. You know, those old dictionaries that were gigantic. And I
Yeah.
found the word shibboleth, and it's got a sentence that uses the example of the word in a sentence, and it's a sentence from one of my dad's stories, and it has his name. And
Wow.
here we are in the heart of the Yale University in this library, and there's my dad somehow there for me. And it was just a moment where I suddenly felt I can be part of this world too. I can be part of the literary world, even though I don't come from a culture that's similar to the cultures of the writers we were studying in my English classes.
Beautiful. I love that. It really brought tears to my eyes because I do feel like my father passed away several years ago. And a big part of my life, I like to call him my spiritual teacher in a way. And I feel him with me often, less so now. I felt him very strong, when he first passed. And but there are moments where things happen, like I guess I call them serendipitous, if you will. And it's sometimes I think it's the universe or whoever it is. There's little moments that are kind of gifted to us, and I get those little moments. And I thought that was such a beautiful one, that your father or the universe, whatever it was, that really presented itself in such a beautiful way, particularly when you were feeling so alienated or maybe not like you belong. And then all of a sudden you had this moment of, yes, I can be here, and I can be proud to be here, and I have a place here. So I thought, really, it's going to it chokes me up. It's so beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad that that episode was meaningful to you.
It really was.
And good for you that you studied at Cambridge, one of the great universities.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It's one of those things, I'm sure you feel the same way too. It's like when you're there, you kind of are like, okay, well, it's not as mystical as you think it is, right? I'm so grateful and blessed that I was able to go. And obviously I did not grow up having, this idea that I could even go to Cambridge, Oxford, even, any of the Ivy Leagues. So I'm definitely grateful I went. But I will say that now everyone's like, oh, you went to Cambridge. And I'm like, yeah, it was special. And there's definitely some moments that are very special, and it's an amazing academic institution. But yeah, when you're there, you're kind of like, okay, I guess it's not as crazy as I thought it was, Anyway,
It is a beautiful campus. I think it's the most beautiful college
it's
campus
stunning.
I've ever
Yeah,
been.
it is. It is. It is. And it is a special, I have very special memories there, Everyone walks around with gowns. They have gowns on. It's properly Harry Potter, but
Hopefully no Voldemort's there.
oh gosh, well, some professor. No, I'm just so after Yale, what, like, because I know you're based in California now. Did you what was the journey? Because you didn't really touch on that per se in the book.
Oh, yeah. I did go back to New York City after I graduated from college, and I studied with a really wonderful poet named June Jordan, who was my mentor in graduate school. And June was also my mentor undergraduate by a weird coincidence.
Hmm.
And I was very lucky to have June as a role model because she was somebody who was a poet, but she also used poetry as a bridge to other literary arts. So she wrote a screenplay, she wrote the libretto of a musical, she wrote a very beautiful young adult novel called His Own Where. She wrote a memoir, a beautiful memoir about her her own childhood in New York called Soldier.
Mm.
And so she was a terrific example in the sense that she showed me that you didn't have to limit yourself to one genre as a literary artist. And, I've dabbled in a lot of other literary arts. I'm also a playwright, and writing this memoir was a very new experience for me because I had not written a memoir before. So it's as you said, it's not like any other memoir you're likely to read, because since I don't really have many memories of my dad, I had to, in a sense, create memories of him by imagining conversations that he was part of.
100%. Yeah. And that was, again, that was so special. And I really appreciate you being so vulnerable with that. And obviously, I'd love to talk about your life as a professional writer, but I think it'd be this is actually a good segue possibly to let's talk about the book a little bit before,
Sure.
because I think with the conversations, they were very intimate, and also, but it felt like you had ideas of what your dad, his personality. He was very almost like cheeky, fun, very charming, and sociable. And so you took that and you brought that character into the conversations, his humor. It was so beautifully done. And and I think even he said in the book, are you sure you want to do this? You want to explore this, because there's going to be some negative things that might come out. And you sure you want to share this, if you will? And I think sometimes that idea of ignorance being bliss, right? Like just keeping someone, in this imagined character, which is so beautiful and so great, because obviously everyone spoke so highly about your father, right? Why do that? Why kind of not only go down those avenues and to showcase the good and the bad, or the light and the dark, if you will? Why do that? And why do it in such a very vulnerable way?
Well, it's not for everyone. When someone dies so young, as my dad, he was 36 when he died, half my age. People say very glowing things about the person, and you don't hear the 360-degree vision of the person. You don't see that. And I wanted to see that. I wanted to know him. I wanted to know his blemishes. And yet I was very afraid to know that, because I was afraid in a way that it would also expose my own weaknesses, because of course I resemble my dad in certain ways that are inevitable. So yeah, it was not an easy journey to go down, because it involved learning things about him and about myself that were complicated and even embarrassing.
Mm.
So yeah, but there were times that I was writing this book that I just started crying and I couldn't write anymore. And yet there were also times that were very funny, because he was a funny man. He wrote a lot of humor. And well, maybe I should read an excerpt to give
Would
a
love
flavor
it.
of the book.
Yes, let's do that.
So let me give you a little bit of background for this excerpt. So my dad, I mentioned that he was in the Navy during World War II, and one of his fellow officer trainees was the writer Herman Wouk, Wouk, who was a very important figure for my parents' generation. He was the first Jewish American to win the Pulitzer Prize, the highest prize in the United States for literature. And he was also, like my dad, in World War II in the Navy. And he wrote a book about his naval experience called The Caine Mutiny, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for almost a whole year and was made into a movie with Humphrey Bogart, et cetera, et cetera. So when the book came out, oddly enough, the protagonist is based quite a bit on my dad and his girlfriend at the time. And when the book came out, my dad, who was a reviewer, was assigned to write a review of the book for the Saturday Review, which was a prestigious review publication in New York at the time. And my dad, oddly enough, even though he was a friend of Herman Wouk, and I played with Herman Wouk's son, and our families were friends, he gave the book a somewhat mixed review, even negative in places. And so I imagine a conversation that took place at the point where my dad sees Herman Wouk again after he's written this somewhat negative review of his friend's book. And it takes place at a cocktail party on Fire Island, this resort near New York, where both our families had homes very close to one another. So my mom and my dad are talking at this cocktail party. My mom says, "Nice party, huh?" And my dad says, "Well, if you like having great martinis on a patio overlooking the ocean around sunset and stimulating conversation with brilliant and funny people, myself, I'd rather be starting a shift in a coal mine." And my mom says, "Don't look now, Lee, but isn't that Herman Wouk bearing down on you? I think I'm going to get some of those delicious hors d'oeuvres way on the other side of the patio. Can I get you anything?" And my dad says, "Just a shield and a helmet." And my mom says, "Blame the review on me." So exit my mom, enter Herman Wouk. And Herman says, "If it isn't Lee Rogow, I don't know if you remember me. I'm your neighbor here on Fire Island. We were buddies in Naval Officer Training School, a fellow writer, and our kids play together." And my dad says, "Hey, you look vaguely familiar." And Herman says, "So, been writing any reviews lately?" And my dad says, "Look, Herman, I was all set to give your novel a great review. I'd written a draft, and then Mickey read the book, and she insisted that it needed a more nuanced treatment." And Herman says, "Nuanced? You mean the way a knife in the back is nuanced?" And my dad says, "Like the umpire says, Herman, I calls him as I sees him." And Herman says, "Well, fortunately, the fans never agree with the umpires." And my dad says, "What do the fans say about writers who use the private information that their buddies tell them about their girlfriends in officers' training school?" And Herman says, "Oh, come on, Lee. You're a writer. You know, we're magpies. We grab any shiny object and take it back to the nest." And my dad replies, "Seems to me you've been taking many shiny objects to the bank lately. How many weeks has the Cane Mutiny been at the top of the New York Times bestseller list?" And Herman says, "Sorry, lost count, 33. And my dad says, "So, what are you doing for an encore? Don't tell me you're adapting the novel for Hollywood." And Herman says, "Actually, I am. I hope you're not planning to review the movie." And interestingly, after my dad published this somewhat negative review of Herman's book, they stayed friends. And I'm wondering if Herman actually respected my dad for his critical judgment and the fact that he didn't just give him a free pass and made a really balanced analysis of his book and respected him enough to do that. And interestingly, Herman Wouk delivered the eulogy at my dad's funeral, and he published a very beautiful elegy to my dad in the same publication, the Saturday Review, where my dad had reviewed his book.
Well, and I was going to say you also included that you included the publication of the eulogy in the, or not the eulogy, sorry, the what do you call it? The
It's kind of an obituary.
obituary, yes.
I'm not sure what you would call it. Yeah, he wrote a letter to the editor of that magazine.
Right. And I thought that was really beautiful to get that tribute.
He wrote a very lovely thing about my dad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, again, these sorts of imaginary conversations, where do you think, like, how did they come to you? Again, I think because I'm a little bit, I like the woo stuff, I like it. And I will say, I do remember, so I was preparing for this interview and I heard you speak on an interview, a talk show with your cousin.
Mhm.
And you had talked about creativity right? And you had said that, I want to make sure I get this wording correct. So you had said that spontaneous creativity, and how you were talking about whether or not, so we were talking about surrealism, that's right. And you were talking about the idea of being able to tap into the spontaneous creativity, if you will. And I thought it was really, what came to mind was, how do you balance that? Because when I was reading your book, I was thinking, is this spontaneous creativity? Is he tapping into this sort of infinite mind, this source that we all have access to when you're writing? And are you allowing that to guide you while you're writing these conversations? And so that I would love to hear how you started writing these imaginary conversations.
I didn't start out thinking I would include that in the book. Initially, I thought I'll put together some things about my dad and my dad's own writings that already exist, and then I'll reflect on those. But then I started hearing these voices in my head, and usually hearing voices in your head is a bad sign. But when you're a writer, it's the best thing, because it's those voices in your head that you need to channel, that you need to record, that you need to encourage to talk more. Say, tell me more, because those are the ways that writers access what you were talking. That I like that phrase, the infinite mind. It's each one of us has our own way that we funnel the infinite mind, but there is that force out there that we can tap into that allows us creativity, spontaneity, improvisation, humor. All of those things come from the infinite mind.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. So what do you think was the most surprising thing that you learned about your dad while writing the book?
Well, I don't want to be a spoiler for my own book, so
I
I don't
know.
speak too much.
Yes.
But I'll say that, the perfect family that my mother portrayed when she talked about our family to me was not as simple as she made it sound. That in particular, there was a couple who I thought it was my godparents, who were very close to my family, and their son was somebody I played with as a child. And there was such a complicated connection between this couple and my parents. I can't even begin to tell you. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but imagine, there was so much going on below the surface with that couple.
Mm.
And very interestingly, those two, my parents and those two other adults, their lives mirrored each other in very strange and eerie ways that I talk about in the book in terms of their
Mhm.
fates, what
Yes.
happened to them.
Yeah. Uh, and I know what you're talking about, and I agree. We don't want to do spoilers. But I honestly do think it was very, very fascinating to see the lives, exactly like you said, they were how they paralleled, and the connections that you didn't even know about probably until maybe, what was it, like 20 years ago, would you say, that you had some conversations? Again, I'm really trying not to give things away, but you had conversation with one person in particular and you learned a lot. And so how many
Yeah,
years ago was that?
I think that was about 10 years ago. So,
Yeah.
of these four adults who were interconnected, knew each other from very early on in their lives when they were teenagers, really.
Yeah.
Um, Only one of them lived a long life, and that was the mother of the other couple. And
Yeah.
she had been my dad's girlfriend, the one who Herman
Mm.
Wouk wrote about in his novel. And she was a nightclub singer, left school, I think, at the age of 13 to go on the stage. And she's quite beautiful. And she was my dad's girlfriend during World War II. And he writes these beautiful passages to her in his wartime journal. It's just these gorgeous love letters kind of to her in the journal. He was a man who had a great capacity for love, I think.
Mm.
And sadly, they didn't make it as a couple for reasons that I can only guess at. But that woman was the one of the four of them who lived a long life. And I did get to talk to her before she passed away. And she said to me, "Are you sure you want to know all this? Because it's not simple." And I said, "Yeah, I want to know the truth." And she told me a lot, and it's all in the book.
Yeah, I love that. And I really do admire your quest for truth. Even things like you called like that could be blemishes or things that unexpected. So what do you think was the most surprising thing that you learned about yourself while writing the book?
Well, I like to go through life thinking that I have no regrets, that I'm a free human being, that I've made these decisions. Some of them are good, some of them not so good, but I have no regrets. Well, I think I do have some regrets. And I think had I had the father that I had for my whole childhood, I think I would have had a better role model as a father and a husband.
Mm.
And not having that, I think, led to some not great choices in my life that my family has sometimes paid a price for. And that was hard to face. That's hard to face.
Yeah. Um, I know you're a father and
Mhm.
you write very proudly about your children, which is so nice. What do you think you've learned about yourself as a father? Because this whole book is about you discovering your father. So what do you think you've learned about yourself as a father?
Well, I only had those 3 years with my dad. And so I don't take for granted any day even that I have with my children as a father. And so I really try to think about all the time that I have with my children as being precious moments that I don't want to waste and that I treasure. And I don't think I could have written this book before I became a dad. I mean, it was only after many decades of thinking about writing something about my dad that I finally had the heart and the stamina to do it. And I think it came from being a father myself, that I could put myself in his shoes in a way that I couldn't have done before.
Yeah, beautiful. What is your intention for this book? What do you hope that the reader comes away having read your book?
Well, I feel it's an uplifting book, even though I hope it's an uplifting book, even though there's a lot of tragedy. It's also about how families can pull together and help one another through even the most acute tragedies. And the book is dedicated to my sister Maggie, and she has been with me through all this. And I would never have been able to write this book if it hadn't been for the fact that my sister jealously held on to every shred of paper that my dad ever wrote that we still
Mm.
had. And some things that my mom had too. There are things that my mom wrote that are in the book as well. And so I do feel like the book leaves you with a sense that even the sharpest cuts can be healed through love.
Mm, that's beautiful. Very nice. So, getting back to life as a professional writer, I do know that there are some listeners who are budding writers. There are some who may have suppressed this creative, method, if you will, method of creativity, because their profession might not really endorse it, if you will. And so I'd love to talk about your life as a professional writer. And one of the questions that came to mind was, and it's probably very a naive question, when, because obviously you've been a writer your whole life, but when did you start your career as a writer, and let's say like a commercial writer, if you will, where you're getting paid for your writing?
Well, I've only been paid for my writing very sporadically. Only a very small amount of my writing has earned money. So I think if you become a writer, you can't start from the premise you're going to get rich as a writer. You have to start from the premise that there's something you really want to get off your chest, something you really want to say, something that you really enjoy talking about, that you want to write about. You have to do it for the love of the writing itself.
Mm.
I do think that it helps to have a day job. I've had all kinds of crazy day jobs in my career. I've worked as an assistant to an art mover where we moved sculptures and paintings from artist studios to galleries to collectors' homes.
Wow.
Worked as the editor of an alumni magazine for the School of Education at UC Berkeley. I've also taught creative writing. So I've had a variety of jobs, but I think it's important to have a very stable source of support because to be a creative, wild soul, you have to be stable and sustain that in your life. You have to have a foundation that is workable.
Mm. Yeah. And so as we move on, we're now closing up the podcast shortly, but do you have any imparting words of wisdom for budding writers? Obviously, you said do it for the love of writing, not to actually make, with the intention that you're going to just, make millions. Is there any advice that you would offer to listeners who may want to explore this avenue?
Well, a couple of things, Nicole. One thing I would say is give yourself the benefit of the doubt. You're not going to write your best work necessarily in the first month that you start writing, or the first year, or maybe even the first decade. You don't know. So be kind to yourself. Don't have unrealistic expectations. It's not an easy field, writing. You have to give yourself time. Read everything you possibly can, even things that you hate, and learn everything you can from what you read. I'd also say find a community of writers who are kindred spirits. One thing that's helped me enormously is I'm in a writers group, and we meet every month, and we spend a little time gossiping about other writers, and then we share all the work that we're doing. And having that group of people who are attentive and thoughtful and critical and supportive has meant so much to me in terms of being able to keep going year after year as a writer. It means so much to me.
Amazing. Brilliant advice. Thank you. Well, we are getting to the EnvisionAir questionnaire, which is it's a fun feature of the podcast where we ask guests to reflect on their past, present, and future. So looking back towards your past, what advice would you give your 15-year-old self?
15-year-old self. Get a better haircut.
Okay.
Show up for class and do the reading.
Yeah.
Before the class, not after.
Right.
Try to understand that women are sometimes very different from men, and hear what they're saying. Really listen to what women are saying, because I think that's not a given for a lot of men. It wasn't for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I like that. I think that's very good advice. I feel bad though, because I think a lot of men probably don't know that, like you said, and it's hard to probably understand without some practical experience with that. So,
Yeah.
but it's good advice to have to keep at the back of your head as a 15-year-old. Reflecting in your present moment, if you could have dinner with one person in the world, who would it be?
Oh, that's a good one. Let me think. Maybe the French actress Fanny Ardant, who was in a lot of Francois Truffaut's movies and who I got to see on stage in Paris, acting the part of Sarah Bernhardt in a one-woman show or a two-person show about the life of Sarah Bernhardt. I've always had a huge crush on Fanny Ardant, and I think that she would be such a fun person to have dinner with. It would have to be in Paris, though.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Which arrondissement would you like to go to?
Oh, wow.
for your dinner with Fanny?
Her favorite restaurant, whatever that would
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So Fanny, if you hear this, you have a possible date night. What's one goal that you would like to achieve in the next 5 years?
There are places in the world I haven't been that I would like to go to. I'd like to see Argentina and Chile. So many wonderful poets from Chile. I'd like to go to India, China. Yeah, there's still places I'd like to visit. I'm a restless soul. I like to travel.
Good.
What else would I like to do? Yeah, I think travel.
So a little wanderlust. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. Well, Zack, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the EnvisionAir podcast. You have been so brilliant, and I really loved your book, and I would encourage everyone to go buy the book. Can you tell the listeners where they can buy the book, and if they want to connect with you, how best to
So
do that?
the book can be gotten on Amazon. You
Amazing.
can also order it from the publisher. The publisher is Spuyten Duyvil Publishing. Hard to spell, Spuyten is the first word. And yeah, I hope that you'll order it. It's as you said, it's not like any memoir you've ever read, but I think it will provoke some interesting feelings.
I think it's
thoughts.
beautiful, beautiful. Honestly, everyone should read it because it will. I told a friend of mine actually yesterday that I feel like it made me fall in love with reading again for pleasure, which is so nice.
That's a wonderful thing to say. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you so
Yes.
much for having me here and for being such a thoughtful and shiny host.
Thank you.
You're very luminous in your presence.
Oh, wow. Well, that means a lot to me. So thank you. And yes, I'm sending you lots of love, and I can't wait, hopefully, to meet you in person.
With pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to the EnvisionAir podcast. Make sure that you like and subscribe to this podcast so that you stay up to date on all of our new episodes.